Okay, I'm going to talk reasonably briefly about the Roman Senate. I'm not going to get into the People's Assemblies because that's for another clip, and I don't want to cross-contaminate the two at this stage. So this is going to be really very, very basic stuff. Enough for higher classics for now, but it will be reinforced and supported with some other videos anyway. Senators of Rome were selected by the censors every 5 years. Originally, there were 300 senators. By the time you get to the late Republic, where we pick up the threads, there were about 600 senators. Only men from wealthy families qualified. Before Sulla, who I've mentioned in another video, who was a conservative general. In 82 BCE, he introduced legislation which meant that if somebody served as a quaestor, this is a low-level government position, they would also then naturally assume the role of a senator at the end of the term of office. And that's what swelled the ranks of the Senate to 600. The idea was that to achieve this position as quaestor, you had to be elected. There had to be an election, and the people had to vote for you. So therefore, if you were in the Senate, that means at some point somebody has voted for you to be there. So nominally, it was democratic. But you'll be able to work out for yourself and see for yourself how misleading or inaccurate that notion is. Especially when you get to the final point on this slide, that once you're a senator, that's you for life. You are a senator until you die. Which in itself is not democratic. In any democratic system, you should have the facility to remove and replace somebody. In terms of power in the Republic, and then latterly in the Empire, the Senate is an advisory chamber. As I've mentioned before, the SEN part of the word comes from the same origin as our words such as senior or senile. And the idea was that this was the chamber of the oldest and the wisest, historically. So these were men best qualified to offer advice on a given situation. But the actual power of legislation, the sovereign power, was with the people's assemblies, which meant the people got to rubber stamp their laws. However, for a number of reasons, the Senate over time became the de facto governing chamber of ancient Rome. Not least because convening a people's assembly was time consuming because the assemblies were very big. The Senate at 600 men could be convened reasonably quickly, not least because these men were very wealthy and they could engage in politics almost as a leisure pursuit. So the Senate met to discuss issues and make decisions. The senators themselves, as mentioned in the last slide, in order to become a senator, you had to previously serve in a position of government, quaestor, aedile, or praetor, or consul even. So in any of those positions, it's a government position. So if you are as far along the ladder to become a senator, it's because you have served in government, you have a knowledge of government, you know what it is to rule. So the idea is, of course, that the Senate is filled with men with all of this political, administrative, government understanding. So of course they should be the best people to make these decisions. It's an interesting theory, but not without considerable flaws. The magistrates, these people, these lower level government positions, in the People's Assembly, would often seek approval or advice on legislation before they put it to the People's Assemblies. So even when the People's Assemblies were going through the process of the more traditional channels of government, the Senate had an enormous guiding influence on legislation that made it through. On top of that, the members of the People's Assemblies did not necessarily have experience of economic administration. They certainly wouldn't have had experience of governing the provinces. So why should the People's Assemblies be given control over governing the provinces? These are men who don't know how to do it. The Senate would have argued. There are perfectly democratic reasons why the People's Assembly should have had those decisions. Anyway, all of these things combined meant that over time the Senate became the ruling body in Rome, which is why whenever you see films set in the ancient world, all of the action of government tends to center around the Senate. I mean, dramatically, it's all these men in one room. It's not several different meeting groups and different areas. Dramatically, it serves a purpose. But also, it's because this is where the decisions tended to be made. Importantly, and I think this says something about the status of the Senate in ancient Rome, emissaries, advocates, ambassadors of other nations, when they visited Rome during the Republican period, they didn't go and stand before the People's Assemblies. They went and they stood before the Senate. And I think that symbolically, that really gets home the idea of the influence and the power that the Senate had. How did it work? Well, simply a senator decides one day that he wants to have a certain matter discussed. Maybe he has a proposal for a change in government laws or something along those lines. And he can convene the meeting. The Senate comes together, they debate that matter. He's the person who's called the meeting, therefore he chairs the meeting. Every senator is allowed to be heard on the issue, but they will be called to speak in descending seniority. So the oldest senator, or the senator who has served for the longest period of time, he would be given his chance to respond first, and then the second, and then the third, all the way down to the new senators who've only recently been admitted to the chamber. Senators did not represent an electorate. We have a tendency, especially when you bear in mind that popular conception of the Senate chamber, to say it's the same as the House of Commons, for example. But in the House of Commons, each one of these men has been elected and voted for, and they've taken their position somewhat democratically. The senators, we've had a look at how they might claim to be democratic, but they're not there representing a group of people at all. They have that position for life. So there is a tendency of the senators to represent their own interests or the interests of the social group with whom they mix. The huge majority of senators were large landowners. They weren't particularly receptive to change that would make Rome more fair, more democratic, would give a greater voice to impoverished people. And that's what happens when you have a chamber that's dominated by people from one particular class, I guess. Well, in the 1st century BC, there was a threat to the Senate through these generals who had armies that were loyal to them rather than to the state of Rome. And this was a real threat to the power of the Senate, especially if the generals were willing to go to the people's assemblies for their legislative needs. Julius Caesar, for example, managed to circumvent the Senate almost completely by speaking to the people's assemblies, but also by invading Rome. And then he appointed himself dictator in perpetuity. If you have a dictator forever, there is no Senate. The Senate has almost no use at all. So the Senate, the people of the Senate, the men of the Senate, fought back against Julius Caesar, ostensibly to restore the Republic, a sort of a form of democracy, but I guess more bluntly, to wrest their power back from him. So the murder of Julius Caesar wasn't just the murder of a man, it was the Senate reasserting its control. As it happens, as you know, the death of Julius Caesar sparked a series of conflicts, which ultimately led to Augustus becoming the first emperor. And in the imperial age, the Senate continues to, ostensibly on the surface, to function, but all of the power was held in the person of the emperor. So the Senate managed to survive into the imperial age, when actually it was just a rubber stamping chamber for the desires, the legislation of the emperor, who was the autocrat. The skinny is somewhat lacking, so please go back over the slides and add in any details that are not on this particular screen. Pause the video for the skinny, and if you have any questions, see me in class.